They told Marilyn Monroe she was checking into a rest facility for exhaustion. She woke up in a locked psychiatric ward with bars on the windows and no way out. For 3 days in February 1961, the most famous woman in the world was trapped in Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York, screaming for help that nobody believed she needed. The doctors said she was delusional. The nurses said she was having a breakdown. But Marilyn knew the truth. She'd been tricked, betrayed, and locked away like her mother before her. And the only person who believed her was the one man she'd divorced 7 years earlier, Joe DiMaggio. It started with exhaustion, which was real enough. Marilyn had just finished filming The Misfits with Clark Gable, a grueling shoot in the Nevada desert where her marriage to Arthur Miller had finally, completely fallen apart. She was taking too many pills to sleep, too many pills to wake up, drinking too much, crying too much. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, was worried. Her internist, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, was worried. And Marilyn herself knew something was wrong. She just wanted to rest, to sleep without pills, to wake up without dread. She wanted help. Dr. Engelberg suggested she check herself into a hospital for a few days. Nothing serious, just rest and observation. Get off the pills gradually under medical supervision. Maybe some therapy, Marilyn agreed. She trusted her doctors. They'd never hurt her. So, on February 7th, 1961, she checked into what she thought was a private rest facility in New York. She packed a small bag. She told friends she'd be back in a few days. She had no idea she was walking into her worst nightmare. The first sign something was wrong came when they took her to her room. It wasn't a room. It was a cell. Bare walls. A bed bolted to the floor. A small window with bars. A door that locked from the outside. Marilyn turned to the nurse, confused. "I think there's been a mistake. This isn't—" The nurse cut her off. "This is your room, Miss Monroe. You'll be staying here." And then she left and locked the door. And Marilyn was alone in a psychiatric ward, realizing too late what had happened. She'd been committed. Not to a rest facility, to Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic, one of New York's most serious mental institutions. To Ward 10, where they kept patients who were considered dangerous to themselves or others. And nobody had told her. Not her doctors, not the admitting staff, not anyone. They'd brought her here under false pretenses, signed the papers, and locked her in. And because she'd technically checked herself in voluntarily, she couldn't leave without a doctor's approval. She was trapped. The realization came in waves. First, I'm in a psychiatric ward. Second, nobody told me. Third, I can't leave. Fourth, this is where my mother has been. And finally, what if they're right? What if I'm losing my mind like she did? That last thought was the cruelest. Marilyn had been fighting the fear of inherited madness her whole life. Gladys had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Mental illness ran in her family like a genetic curse. Every moment of depression, every panic attack. Was this it? Was this the beginning? And now doctors had decided she needed to be locked up, and part of her wondered if they'd seen something she couldn't see herself. But no. She knew the difference. She was exhausted, yes. Depressed, yes. Taking too many pills, absolutely. But she wasn't psychotic. She wasn't delusional. She wasn't dangerous. The problem was that knowing you're sane doesn't help when you're locked in a place designed for people who don't know they're not sane. Marilyn started screaming, pounding on the door, demanding to be let out. This was a mistake. She wasn't supposed to be here. She'd agreed to rest, not to be locked in a psychiatric ward. But the more she screamed, the more the staff treated her as exactly the kind of patient who belonged there. "You need to calm down, Miss Monroe. If you don't stop, we'll have to sedate you." Her panic was being used as proof of her insanity. The worst part was looking through that barred window and seeing other patients, genuinely mentally ill people, some in distress, some heavily medicated, some just staring at nothing. Marilyn's mother, Gladys, had spent most of Marilyn's childhood in institutions like this. Marilyn had visited her mother in these places, seen the bars and the locks and the hopelessness. She'd spent her entire life terrified of ending up like her mother. And now here she was, locked in the same kind of ward, and nobody would believe she didn't belong there. The sounds were almost worse than the sights. Someone screaming down the hall. Someone else sobbing. The shuffle of heavily sedated patients being led to their rooms. The jangle of keys. The click of locks. All of it echoed through the corridors, creating a symphony of institutional control and human suffering. This was what her mother's life had sounded like for decades. These were the sounds that had haunted Marilyn's childhood visits. And now they were the soundtrack to her own imprisonment. At night, it was worse. The lights dimmed but never went fully dark. Institutional lighting that made sleep impossible. Strange noises filtered through the walls. And Marilyn lay on that bolted-down bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how her life had led to this moment. 3 days ago, she'd been a movie star. Now she was patient 23453 in a locked psychiatric ward, and her fame meant nothing. She thought about all the times she'd played vulnerable women in movies. Directors loved that quality in her. Audiences loved it, but when she was actually vulnerable, actually in need of help, the response wasn't care. It was imprisonment. The world loved watching Marilyn Monroe play fragile. They just didn't want to deal with her actually being fragile. The nurses knew who she was, of course. Marilyn Monroe, movie star. But that didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. They treated her with a mixture of suspicion and voyeuristic curiosity. Some would peek through the small window in her door, watching her like she was an exhibit. Others clearly thought she was faking her distress for attention. One nurse reportedly said, "Actresses are all the same. Everything's a performance." Marilyn was learning that being famous didn't mean being believed. It meant being a spectacle even in your worst moments. Wait until you hear what happened on the second day. Marilyn asked to use the phone. She needed to call someone, anyone, to explain what had happened and get her out. After hours of asking, they finally let her make a call. But here's the thing. Who do you call when you're locked in a psychiatric ward? Her psychiatrist had put her there. Her internist had signed the papers. Arthur Miller, her husband, was about to divorce her and wouldn't have helped anyway. Most of her Hollywood friends would have thought she really was having a breakdown and needed to be there. There was only one person Marilyn could think of who would believe her without question, who would drop everything to help her, who she trusted completely. Joe DiMaggio, her ex-husband, the man she'd divorced in 1954 after only 9 months of marriage because he couldn't handle her fame and she couldn't give up her career. They'd been apart for 7 years. She hadn't spoken to him in months. But in that moment, locked in that cell, Joe was the only person in the world she knew would come for her. The call was brief. Marilyn's voice was shaking, barely holding back panic. "Joe, it's Marilyn." "They locked me up. I need help, please." Joe didn't ask questions. Didn't need explanations. Just said, "I'm coming. Don't worry. I'm coming." And he hung up and immediately started making calls, demanding to know where exactly Marilyn was and how to get her out. But getting someone out of a psychiatric ward isn't like bailing someone out of jail. The doctors insisted Marilyn needed to stay. She was experiencing delusions, they said. She was convinced she'd been tricked into being there, which proved she lacked insight into her condition. Her panic was a symptom. Her demands to leave were evidence of her inability to make rational decisions. The system was perfectly designed to keep people locked up, because any behavior that suggested you wanted to leave could be interpreted as proof you needed to stay. Joe DiMaggio showed up at Payne Whitney like a man on a mission. This was the Joe DiMaggio who'd been one of the greatest baseball players in American history, who'd been a national hero, who had the kind of old-school masculine authority that made doctors and administrators pay attention, and he was furious. He didn't care about their protocols or their medical opinions. He wanted to see Marilyn, and he wanted her released. Now. The confrontation in the hospital administrative offices became legendary. Joe, according to witnesses, was barely containing his rage. He'd tried being reasonable. That hadn't worked. So now he was done with reasonable. He wanted to see Marilyn, and he wanted to know which doctor thought it was appropriate to lock someone in a psychiatric ward by lying to them. The administrators tried to explain. Miss Monroe had checked herself in voluntarily. She was receiving necessary care. Her resistance was a common symptom. Joe listened, and then he said something that changed everything. He told them he'd call every reporter in New York. He'd hold a press conference on the hospital steps. And he'd tell them exactly what Payne Whitney did to Marilyn Monroe. That threat changed everything. The last thing any psychiatric hospital wanted in 1961 was publicity about patient treatment. If Joe DiMaggio held a press conference saying Payne Whitney had locked up Marilyn Monroe under false pretenses, it would be a national scandal. The hospital's reputation would be destroyed. The staff tried to explain. Miss Monroe was under psychiatric care. She'd checked herself in voluntarily. She was receiving treatment for— Joe cut them off. "Let me see her. Right now." His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. They took him to Ward 10, unlocked Marilyn's door, and let him in. What he saw made him even angrier. Marilyn, one of the most beautiful, vibrant people he'd ever known, sitting on a bolted-down bed in a bare cell with bars on the window, looking terrified and exhausted and defeated. She ran to him, started crying, tried to explain everything at once. How they'd lied to her, how she wasn't supposed to be here, how she just wanted to rest and they locked her in a psychiatric ward. Joe held her and said the words she desperately needed to hear. "I believe you, and I'm getting you out of here." Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "Maybe the doctors know best." Just, "I believe you. And I'm getting you out." But here's what made it even harder. Joe couldn't just take her. Despite his fame, despite his fury, despite Marilyn begging him to take her away, the hospital had legal authority over her. They'd admitted her. They'd diagnosed her. And they weren't releasing her just because Joe DiMaggio demanded it. He needed her psychiatrist's approval, and her psychiatrist was the one who'd put her there in the first place. What happened next has become legendary. Joe DiMaggio, according to multiple accounts, essentially threatened to tear the hospital apart if they didn't release Marilyn. He told administrators he'd call every reporter in New York and tell them how they were treating Marilyn Monroe. He'd make Payne Whitney the most famous psychiatric hospital in America for all the wrong reasons. He'd sue them, expose them, destroy their reputation. And he had the money, the fame, and the connections to do it. The hospital administration started making phone calls. On the third day, February 10, 1961, Marilyn Monroe was transferred to Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, a regular hospital where she could rest without being locked in a psychiatric ward. Joe had gotten her out. He'd believed her when nobody else did. He'd used his influence to free her from a system designed to keep people trapped. And Marilyn would never forget it. Years later, even after she was gone, people would talk about that moment as proof of who Joe DiMaggio really was. The one person who loved Marilyn Monroe more than he loved anything else, even when their marriage was long over. But the trauma of those 3 days never left Marilyn. Being locked in that ward, seeing the bars, hearing the other patients, feeling the helplessness, it confirmed her deepest fear. She could end up like her mother. The same madness that had destroyed Gladys could destroy her too. And worse, the system that was supposed to help people with mental illness could trap you, could take away your freedom, could treat your terror as a symptom rather than a rational response to being imprisoned. The experience made Marilyn even more terrified of psychiatric treatment, even though she desperately needed it. She'd been betrayed by doctors she trusted. They'd lied to her, committed her against her actual wishes while technically getting her voluntary consent, and then refused to believe her when she said she didn't belong there. How do you trust psychiatrists after that? How do you ask for help when asking for help got you locked in a cell? And here's something that makes the story even more heartbreaking. Marilyn probably did need help. She was struggling with depression, anxiety, addiction. She was in genuine crisis. But the way she was treated at Payne Whitney, the deception, the locked ward, the bars, the refusal to listen, made it less likely she'd ever trust mental health treatment again. The system that was supposed to help her ended up traumatizing her further and making her more resistant to the help she actually needed. There's also a broader question about what happened. Did Marilyn's doctors genuinely think a locked psychiatric ward was the right treatment? Or did they panic because they had a famous patient in crisis and wanted to make sure she couldn't hurt herself, even if it meant traumatizing her in the process? The decision to send her to Payne Whitney without fully explaining where she was going suggests they knew she wouldn't have agreed if she'd known. They chose to deceive her for her own good, which is a phrase that's been used to justify countless psychiatric abuses throughout history. The power dynamic was impossible. Marilyn was a woman in 1961, a time when women could be committed to psychiatric institutions by male relatives with frightening ease. She was a celebrity, which meant people assumed her distress was performative. She had a documented history of anxiety and depression, which meant her fears were always suspect. And she'd checked herself in voluntarily, which meant she'd technically given them authority over her. Every structural factor worked against her being believed. Joe DiMaggio's intervention reveals something important about power and belief. He was believed when Marilyn wasn't, partly because he was a man, partly because he was calm while she was panicking, partly because he had the kind of authority that institutions respect. If Joe hadn't believed her, if he'd sided with the doctors and said maybe she did need to be there, Marilyn might have been stuck in that ward much longer. Her freedom depended on having someone with more power than her willing to fight the system on her behalf. After Marilyn was transferred to Columbia Presbyterian, she spent 3 more weeks there, this time by actual choice, getting rest and medical care in an environment where she could leave if she wanted to. Joe visited her almost every day, brought her flowers, sat with her, made sure she felt safe. Other friends visited too, but Joe was the constant. He'd proven he was the one person she could count on in crisis. And Marilyn, who'd spent her life trying to figure out who genuinely cared about her versus who wanted something from her, knew without doubt that Joe's love was real. The Payne Whitney incident didn't make major headlines at the time. Marilyn's representatives released a statement saying she'd been hospitalized for exhaustion and was resting comfortably. Most of the public never knew she'd been locked in a psychiatric ward. But in Hollywood, people knew, and it became another data point in the growing narrative that Marilyn Monroe was difficult, unstable, uninsurable. The very thing she'd been trying to avoid, being seen as mentally ill like her mother, had happened, and it made her career even more precarious. What's particularly cruel is that Marilyn's fear of psychiatric institutions was completely rational, given what happened to her mother and what almost happened to her. Gladys Baker had been institutionalized for schizophrenia and spent decades in mental hospitals, receiving treatments like electroshock therapy. Marilyn had grown up visiting her mother in these places, seeing what psychiatric care actually looked like in mid-century America. Her terror wasn't irrational. It was based on direct observation of a system that often did more harm than good, and yet Marilyn kept trying to get help. After the Payne Whitney disaster, she continued working with psychiatrists, trying to manage her depression and anxiety. She was seeing Dr. Greenson right up until her death. The fact that she kept seeking treatment even after being so badly betrayed by the mental health system shows genuine courage. She knew she needed help. She just never found a form of help that actually worked, that treated her as a person rather than a diagnosis, that respected her autonomy while supporting her healing. The story also reveals the impossible position of being Marilyn Monroe. When she sought help for mental health struggles, she was locked in a psychiatric ward. When she showed up late to film sets because of anxiety and medication, she was fired and sued. When she died from an overdose of sleeping pills, people debated whether she'd killed herself intentionally or accidentally, as if those were the only 2 options, as if there wasn't a third possibility, that she was just trying to sleep, and the line between the dose that worked and the dose that killed had become too thin to see. Joe DiMaggio's rescue of Marilyn from Payne Whitney became part of his own mythology too. For the rest of his life, people who knew him said that getting Marilyn out of that psychiatric ward was one of the things he was most proud of. Not his baseball records, not his fame, the fact that he'd saved Marilyn when she needed him. And after Marilyn died, Joe organized her funeral, kept reporters away from it, had roses delivered to her grave 3 times a week for 20 years. He never remarried. Some people say he never stopped loving her. But here's the complex truth. Joe loving Marilyn didn't mean their marriage could have worked. He couldn't handle her fame when they were married. He wanted her to be Mrs. DiMaggio, to give up her career to be private and domestic. Marilyn couldn't do that. She was Marilyn Monroe, and being Marilyn Monroe was the only thing that had saved her from the poverty and powerlessness of Norma Jean. They couldn't stay married. But that didn't mean they stopped caring about each other. And in that moment of absolute crisis in February 1961, Joe proved that whatever else was true, he would always protect her when she needed him. The Payne Whitney experience is often left out of Marilyn Monroe retrospectives. It's not glamorous. It doesn't fit the narrative of the tragic blonde bombshell. It's too uncomfortable. Too much about systems of power and psychiatric abuse and the ways women's distress gets pathologized. But it's crucial for understanding Marilyn's last years. That 3-day imprisonment intensified her fears, deepened her trauma, and made her even more dependent on the pills that would eventually kill her. Because how do you ask for help when asking for help gets you locked up? What would proper mental health care have looked like for Marilyn? Probably not a locked psychiatric ward. Probably not psychiatrists who deceived her about where she was going. Probably not a system that treated her panic as a symptom rather than a reasonable response to being trapped. Maybe it would have looked like trauma therapy for her childhood abuse. Maybe it would have looked like support for leaving situations and people who were harmful. Maybe it would have looked like helping her find an identity beyond Marilyn Monroe, so she wouldn't be so terrified of losing the performance. But that kind of care wasn't really available in 1961, especially not for someone as famous as Marilyn. The mental health system at that time was about control and containment more than healing. Electroshock therapy was still common. Psychiatric medications were crude and often made things worse. And the power patients had over their own treatment was minimal, especially if they were women, especially if they were famous. Marilyn was trapped in multiple ways, by her trauma, by her fame, by a system that didn't know how to actually help her. The 3 days at Payne Whitney also reveal something about the performance of sanity. Marilyn was in genuine distress when she went to the hospital. She needed rest, needed help managing her medication, needed support. But the moment she was locked in that psychiatric ward and started panicking, her genuine distress was interpreted as psychosis. There's no way to react to being imprisoned that doesn't look like a symptom of the mental illness they've decided you have. Calm acceptance would be evidence of being too heavily medicated. Panic is evidence of being delusional. Anger is evidence of being dangerous. The system is designed so you can't win. Looking at those 3 days from the outside, what's striking is how everyone had good intentions. The doctors genuinely thought they were helping. The hospital staff genuinely thought she needed to be there. Even the deception about where she was going was probably justified in their minds as necessary to get her the treatment she needed. Good intentions, the desire to help, professional expertise. None of it prevented Marilyn from being traumatized by an experience that made everything worse. That's the story of so much psychiatric care. Well-meaning people operating within a system that's fundamentally broken, causing harm while believing they're helping. The fact that Joe DiMaggio had to threaten the hospital to get Marilyn released reveals how fragile patient rights were. If Marilyn hadn't had a famous ex-husband willing to fight for her, she might have been stuck there much longer. How many other women were locked in psychiatric wards in 1961 against their will, unable to get out because they didn't have someone with Joe's power advocating for them? Marilyn's story is individual, but it's also representative of a system that gave mental health professionals almost unlimited power over patients, with very little accountability. Marilyn never publicly talked about what happened at Payne Whitney in detail. She told friends. She mentioned it in therapy, but she never gave interviews about it, never wrote about it extensively. Maybe because the stigma was too great. Maybe because she knew people wouldn't believe her. They'd think she really had been crazy and just didn't remember it correctly. Maybe because talking about it meant reliving it, and she was trying so hard to move forward. But her silence meant most people never knew. The trauma stayed private, known only to the people closest to her. When Marilyn Monroe died 18 months later, Joe DiMaggio was the one who took control of her funeral arrangements. He banned most of Hollywood from attending, particularly the people he felt had exploited her. And in those decisions, you can feel the echo of Payne Whitney, Joe protecting Marilyn from a system and an industry that had never protected her when she was alive. It was too late, of course. But it was the last thing he could do for her. Keep her safe, even in death, from the people and institutions that had hurt her in life. The story of Marilyn Monroe and Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic is ultimately about trust, power, and the impossible situation of being someone who needs help in a system not designed to actually provide it. It's about the man who believed her when nobody else did. And it's about the trauma of being trapped, being disbelieved, being treated as if your fear of being imprisoned is proof you should be imprisoned. That 3-day nightmare in February 1961 might not be the most famous chapter of Marilyn's story, but it might be one of the most revealing about what it actually felt like to be her. Famous, beautiful, desperate, and utterly alone except for one man who'd walk through fire to save her. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a situation where asking for help made things worse? Have you been disbelieved when you were telling the truth about your own experience? How do you trust systems that have failed you? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more stories about the reality behind the icon, the humans behind the legends, and the systems that fail the people they're supposed to help. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.